Hello, welcome to Plant Party Spring Green Up, hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and fun education. I'm Megan Clayton, Professor and Extension Range Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. My co-hosts are Tim Sigmund, the Private Lands Program Leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Charles Knifer, State Resource Conservationist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We'd like to thank our door prize sponsors, Bamert Seed, InView Range and Pasture, Native American Seed, Texas Quail Forever, Renewable Resources Extension Act, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these neat prizes.
We'll be moving very quickly through 5 presentations today.
Our first presenter today is Dr. Monty Roquette. Dr. Roquette is a professor of forage physiology at the Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension Center at Overton and a Regents Fellow with the Texas A&M University System. He's been a researcher at the Overton Center for over 50 years. He's well known for his long-term livestock stocking experiments on Bermuda grass overseeded with ryegrass or clover and stocking strategies to provide information on average daily gain for livestock. He's been involved with 11 forage cultivar releases and has mentored 68 graduate students. He'll be presenting on how soil temperature dictates plant physiological functions. Thanks for kicking off our plant party, Dr. Roquette.
Drives germination, directly affects root development and plant growth. Soil temperature is a catalyst for the biological processes. Most soil organisms, microbes, function best at an optimum soil temperature. It impacts the rate of nitrification. It's in charge, did you know that? It influences soil moisture content, aeration, and availability of plant nutrients and overall soil health. Soil constitutes a major storage site for heat. So some effects of extreme temperatures: at low temperatures, slow germination, reduced root development, decreases mineralization, reduces microbial activity, and organic matter decomposes slowly. What we see, some of these at the high temperature, are stressed roots, reduced water availability due to increased evaporation, altered microbial activity, potential heat stress, and plant wilting. That's the sign. It's like observations of vegetation. You look at the vegetation, you can almost guess or know what the soil may be or what the soil moisture might be. So that's a great visualization there. Heat, plant wilting. Organic matter decomposition increases by movement of soluble substrates in the soil. So some factors that affect the amount of heat supplied to the soil surface: soil color. Dark soils absorb more heat and usually have higher temperatures. Soil mulch and vegetative cover. Slope of the land. Radiation reaching the surface at an angle is usually a decreased temperature. So by sloped land. Organic matter content, water holding capacity, and color effects. Evaporation and solar radiation. Soil water uses the energy from solar radiation to evaporate, therefore is not available to heat the soil. So some of those factors that affect the amount of heat dissipated from the soil surface include soil moisture content. Heat flow is higher in a wet soil than a dry soil where the pores are filled with air. Excuse me, the rate of dissipation increases with moisture content. And bulk density. A high bulk density increases soil surface area and increases the amount of heat dissipated. Now, measuring soil temperature. Soil thermometers are the most common tool for measuring soil temperatures. A standard digital thermometer will also work for general soil health assessment if you're into that mode of wanting to know exactly what the soil temperature is. If you do, the best time, the best season and depth to measure is in the summer, June, July, and August, during the growing season, between 1 and 2 p.m., 4 inches below the soil surface under bare soil. As far as location, be consistent with measurements, same area of field, soil type, weather, and precipitation. And a caveat there, same situation if you're measuring soil pH. Don't just measure it anytime. Same area, same soil, not the same area, but the same location in general in the same season. Soil temperature and activity. Go back, and we'll say from 70 to 100, at 70 degrees, about 100% of the moisture is used for plant growth, and the ideal range for nitrification in plant growth and planting is about 65 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. At 90 degrees, plant growth slows. At 100 degrees Fahrenheit, about 15% of the moisture used for growth, but about 85% of the moisture is lost through evaporation and transpiration. At 113 degrees Fahrenheit, some bacteria species, bad and good, start dying. At 130 degrees Fahrenheit, yes, 100% of the moisture is lost through evaporation or transpiration. And if you're in the desert at 140 degrees, soil bacteria dies. Now, management options that affect soil temperature for better plant growth, what are they? Use cover crops on cultivated sites or pastures, provides insulation and shading. Conservation tillage, use no-till to minimize soil disturbance and help maintain soil temperature. And I know that we're out of the range for many people, depending on whether you're exclusive arid, semi-arid, rangeland, or if you're in humid pasture. So take this as some of those factors or options that affect it. Crop rotation. Rotating crops with different root depths can improve soil aeration and water infiltration. So the question is, how do these management options for soil temperature fit into management strategies for rangeland and pastures? We know that answer. If you're in AgriLife Research or AgriLife Extension, we've got the answer. And that is, it depends. And it depends on what? It depends on whether or not it's cultivated property and or seasonal cropping. And that, when we talk about that, we're into cropping properties and farmland, not, it may be a part of a rangeland situation, but that's a situation within itself, and that strategy does affect soil temperature. Usually it leads to more higher temperatures. And the subject of where we are in grasslands, rangeland and pastures, annuals or perennials forages, grasses versus legumes, different time of growth, different type of rooting zone. Forbs, we're going to hear more about that, not about so much temperature effects, but we're going to hear about forbs, and we're going to hear about brush trees. All that affects the management strategies that affect soil temperature. And the biggest one of the biggest ones, stocking rate and stocking methods on grazed property. You've seen it, you know it, you read about it. The stocking rate controls, and it becomes the most important factor. Stocking methods control that, but stocking rate is one of those factors that you really must get a handle on. So what I've said is, kick the dirt off your boots and pay attention to your soil. Thank you very much again, Megan. I appreciate the opportunity to join in this plant party today. And if there's any other questions along the way, I will do my best to answer some of them, if not all of them. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Roquette. We're just going to roll right into our second presentation. Next up will be Dr. Baron Rector. He's an associate professor and extension range specialist for over 40 years. Dr. Rector is legendary for his plant identification skills, response to toxic plant concerns, invasive plant management, and lively presentations. He supports county extension programs in the north and eastern portions of the state, though it's not unusual to see him all over. He's the main supporter of state 4-H plant identification contests, and my unit would not be the same without him. We'll turn it over to you, Dr. Rector, to tell us about how a grass grows.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to be talking to you about something that I think we've been studying since the beginning of time, and that is how grass grows. And so I feel fortunate to be talking about it today. And I want to share some of the ideas that I have because since I work at times all over the state, what is our vision of how Texas grasses once looked? And so we had the bison here, and the 2003 bison book indicates that the bison went to the same area to graze once a year or once in every 10 years. Quite a range, and much different than what we do under private property rights, where our cattle, our sheep, our goats, and some of our wildlife species never leave our property and they don't migrate away. So as Dr. Roquette was talking about it, the stocking rate becomes very paramount in this case. So in Texas, we have about, always changing, but 650 grass taxa, 560 species of native and introduced grasses, and they occur statewide. And so how do you look at grass? And so what's your perspective? Because if you only look at the product, the cow, the sheep, the goat, the meat products, then you're going to miss seeing the grass grow or disappear. And I will tell you that a lot of people have missed seeing the grass disappear off of the land because it happens over time. So when I look at a grass plant, notice that the grass plant, every part of it, from the stolons, the rhizomes, the stems, the leaves, the spikelets, the florets, all are involved in determining how a grass grows. And some people call the caryopsis, or the seed of a grass, they call it a grain. And there's other terminology here. In this one, they called it a seed. So, but generally, the seed companies sell seed, but we have all kinds of names that we use as people. So in this image, with this orange stamen sticking out, notice that the female flowers with the stigmas are down at the bottom of that column, and everything on top, like in corn, are the stamen and producing the pollen. But we also have various colors. Sometimes color is not definitive, but you ask the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And you might say, what came first, the grass plant or the seed? And so looking at germination and beginning a process of looking at how a grass grows. This is an eastern gamagrass seed in the picture that has a root system and new leaves that have emerged. And what we know is Thad Box taught us years ago that grass seeds need 30 days of excellent soil moisture and temperature for a seedling to survive. And so here, Eastern Gamagrass, our largest native grass seed in the state, and it's showing you how it is germinated and started growing. In this image, where the arrow is, I'm showing you what the caryopsis of a yellow Indian grass seed looks like. And compared to the Eastern Gamagrass, which was about 5 millimeters long, this yellow Indian grass seed is 2.4 millimeters in this image right here. So a grass seedling comes up from that seed with correct soil temperature, available soil moisture, and we have plants that come up, grasses that come up in the fall, our cool season, and we have grasses that come up in the spring, our warm season. So here's a warm season because I just took this picture yesterday. So this is a picture of the seedling of little blue stem, and this is 10 days after a prescribed burn on the site, but the site had good moisture. The blue arrow is pointing that when I can see the auricle and the ligule, that more than likely that grass leaf is an adult and will not continue to grow. But look at the top, the third leaf up. I cannot see the auricle. I cannot see the ligule. And what Jerry Stuth taught us in grazing management a long time ago, that when I graze the grass and I eat the top or I eat half of the leaves, which leaves will continue to grow? It's the leaves that will continue elongating or the ones that I can't see the auricle down at the base. So two of these leaves are not going to grow if I were to remove half of the leaves or all of those leaves. So the soil is so important, because what you're looking at in this picture on the post oak savanna is little blue stem, and the black colored humus below it is what's reforming from an area that in 1940 was a cotton field. And so this is how the grass is coming back. And our soil, which had been messed up through farming, the soil aggregate stability, the bulk density, the amount of organic carbon in the soil, how water gets in the soil, is reforming so that we can grow that grass. Early people that came to the state noted that the grass was belly high or stirrup high to a horse. The main thing we've ascertained from that is that was in the flowering, the stem elongation from a bud that produced a stem that was going to go to flower, and that would be tickling the belly of the horse. Most of the time, at 30 inches tall, eastern gamagrass leaves fall over, and so a 30-inch leaf of any of our native species is a pretty big one, except in eastern gamagrass, I have measured leaves up to the length of 86 inches over outside of Gatesville. So this picture, which is in all of our training, notice that we have these 8 leaves, and that when I'm looking at how they're arranged down in the meristem, down in the bud where the leaves are emerging, there is a methodology of how they're going to come out. Once that has occurred and the 8th leaf has come out, then that tiller will quit growing, and then I'll have others from buds that will start growing. So this is the arrangement and the order out of the meristem bud on where they're going to arise from. So the growing point is the meristems, close to the ground. And if it's close to the ground, it's more protected from grazing. It's more protected from mowing. So we produce, when I'm close to the ground, produce leaves in 1 to 2 years. We often ask, how long do these things live? And so if it's elevated above the ground, it's unprotected. If eaten or makes a seed head, the tiller dies. And these 5 images I'm using are out of a talk that our former unit leader, Dr. Bob Lyons, put together. So grazing point elevation. When I'm thinking about what grass I'm looking at, does it have grazing resistance? How is that grass going to grow? And so look at buffalo grass, always remains close to the ground, and it has high grazing resistance. Cow eats with its tongue, sticks the tongue out, wraps it around the grass. Well, if you're a 2-inch buffalo grass, then for the cow to eat that likes 3-inch tall grass, you'd probably become a lip eater and eat with your lips. But these grasses are showing we have high, moderate, and low grazing resistant grasses that grow. So in our leaf and root growth, look at the leaf volume at the bottom on the x-axis, the reduced root growth as a percentage going up the y-axis. And so as the leaf volume increases, the reduced root growth also changes. And so as I look at this example, the plant on the left, and this is a commonly used image, the plant on the left has not had any top growth removed, and look at the depth of the root system. And under moderate grazing, where half of the plant's growth has been taken, then I have a little bit of reduction, but not much. But when I'm overgrazing the plant, I'm going to really reduce the amount. I don't have enough leaves supporting the root system. The amount of roots that die and decompose through the year start increasing. And this is very important because if I'm on the Kanza Prairie, we know that there are big blue stem plants that have roots down into the ground up to 10 feet. But what is it in the hill country when you only have 3 inches of soil? So I'm looking at what gets reduced. And as Monty said, water infiltration can be affected, water absorption, nutrient absorption can be effective, and I have a loss of a competitive advantage here. So forage residue has caused us to set some height and then some pounds of grass on the land to preserve the grass and preserve the function and properties of the grass. So this common table on our tall grasses, we need to have 1,200 to 1,500 pounds of dry matter per acre every day of the year. And so we need to leave a stubble height of 12 to 14 inches. Now, how many of your ranchers are going to do that? And then look at our midgrass, 750 to 1,100 pounds, 6 to 8 inch stubble, short grass, 2 to 3 inches of stubble. So here's big blue stem, and how is it growing? It's on the roadside. It's not in that pasture behind it. It has this kind of flower head, and this is what it looks like in Bosque County after a February the 4th burn. And this is in April, and this is the grass that's come back because the fire did not kill the structure of the grass underground. Here are the grass leaves that have grown after that picture. Here's what they look like after I've come in and grazed it. And look at the back of the rock. You see brown tips where half of the leaves have been removed. But look at the leaves and which ones will continue to grow after the grazing event, because a leaf that can elongate and continue to grow gives me more cover back, more grazable food back quicker than if I have grazed it to the ground and all my new growth has to come through the slow process of buds and tillering. Well, look at this picture of little blue stem. That is an 8-inch stubble height. That's a tall grass. That's what some people call it a midgrass, but that's the amount I'm wanting to leave. And look, the cows did not eat the stems because those are not a high priority. So out at the range area on March 8th, we did a burn. And here is an example where 32 leaf buds in the crown of the grass germinated and came to life. Now that's a lot. And this is only 10 days after the fire. And this is just day before yesterday. So Dr. Morgan Treadwell, who works on these buds and looks at bud banks, she knows that the bud banks coming out of the crown of the grass, that temperature, moisture availability, hormonal signals, the photo period, and bud dormancy control when that bud is going to initiate. Well, once a bud breaks, the stem and leaf growth are driven by resource availability, meristem activity, and environmental conditions, as Monty pointed out, to sustain the growth of the plant and not get too hot and maintain water. But here is a key. We burned at the end of winter, early spring. Does that have an effect? And yes, it does. If everything is right, I can get this green up effect. But why I'm getting the green up effect, the soil after a fire is going to be bare. The sun is going to be driving the water out of the soil and evaporating it into the atmosphere. So I don't want to keep an area bare of forage for very long. I want to benefit my grass by getting the cover back and resting my land from mowing, resting my land from grazing. So here is a picture. These are litter dams scattered through the picture. I have water moving over the surface of the soil if I don't keep it covered. This is last week at Menard on the 14th. The grass in the plot is sand drop seed. What kind of management would it take here on the Forked Lightning Ranch to bring the grass back? What do you think is happening there? And notice that this is a soil crusting problem as well, and that the soil here is somewhere between 3 to 11 inches deep. In the old days, We cut native grass for hay. Look at this nice field over toward Brenham. And in Grimes County in 1952, look at the result. The ungrazed native grass on the left, the grazed on the right. But look at the kind of equipment that left more stubble than our hay producers are leaving today. Matter of fact, to pay for the fertilizer, they think they got to hay that at the end of October going into November and leave that totally open and bare ground all through the winter months, which may be the months that we can hold on to soil moisture the best. So here is Little Blue Stem in Bosque County after a fire, and notice that shading and removing the sun, the buds in the middle of that crown died because plants have to have sunlight. Here's what a switchgrass looks like at 7 days after a fire, and the leaves are extending and new leaves are coming out. Well, we find that in the world of prescribed burning, that grasses are better adapted to fire than woody plants and any of our forbs. And if I maintain that grass, I keep my moisture longer and I get a higher rate of infiltration and a lower rate of runoff. And I'm trying to put the water I get in the soil. So what are the goals behind our recommended practices? And this is in 1984 in the drought in Kennedy County. Sometimes we call these lizard licked, where all the forage is removed. What kind of livestock? 1 goat to the acre on the left, 3 goats to the acre on the right. And look, this was a fence put in and the vegetation is different. Here's the impact of mowing. The Little Blue Stem on the left. This has been mowed on this same mow line for 25 consecutive years, and the grass on the right that can sustain the mowing replaced the Little Blue Stem, and its name is Bahia grass. So, and here's the Bahia grass trying to move in and take over the Little Blue Stem. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, life minus grass equals 0. How you treated the people and the land, not how much money you made, not how many trophies you won, is the most enduring impact you can leave on the earth. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Dr. Rector. That was great.
All right, next up, we have Dr. Stacy Hines to speak on how a forb grows. Dr. Hines is an assistant professor in the Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management, and Extension Rangeland Habitat Management Specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Her extension and research interests focus on the varied interconnection between rangeland, the native, improved, and invasive plant species in them, and the livestock and wildlife they support. Dr. Hines is out of town with today, but has generously pre-recorded a presentation just for us. Megan, I'll let you start the recording.
My name is Dr. Stacy Hines. I'm the Extension Rangeland Habitat Management Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, based here in Corpus Christi, Texas. Thanks for letting me pre-record this message so that way I can enjoy spending time with my parents and celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. So if you have any questions after my presentation, you guys are in great hands. Dr. Megan Clayton and Dr. Baron Rector, wonderful resources to help answer any of those questions. But I'll also leave some contact information for you guys if you want to reach out to me after this presentation. Let's get the party started and talk about how a forb grows. The learning objectives for this short presentation is to talk about plant life cycles of forbs, discuss the forb growth during these various life cycle strategies, and then to relate some of these life cycle strategies to appropriate management actions. I'm going to give you a brief overview of all of these life cycle strategies, and then we're going to go into a lot more detail with each one of these. Annual forbs, these are the ones that are going to complete their life cycle in a single year, and typically this is going to be a season or 2. Biennials, they can complete their life cycle in 2 years or maybe 2 growing seasons. And in the first year, or the first growing season, is going to be in a vegetative state, and the second year, or the second growing season, is in a reproductive stage. For perennials, these plants are going to persist on the landscape for multiple years. They may go dormant, but they are going to regrow the next season from the roots. Now let's talk about annual forbs specifically and talk just a little bit about their growth and what's going on with each one of these stages. An example of an annual forb here in South Texas is the spiny or prickly sow thistle. Now these are going to start off as seeds, and inside the seed, that baby plant is composed of the embryonic or baby root, the stem, in the leaves, and also the endosperm, which has stored energy. Now, when the temperature is optimal, water and oxygen are going to be taken in through that seed coat, and the cells within this embryo, they actually begin to enlarge. This seed coat is also going to start to soften. Now inside, the cells, they've come alive, they start to use the food reserves, and they're making proteins. These cells are elongating and they're dividing, and eventually the seed coat is going to break open, and the cells have elongated and divided enough to bring out the baby root or the radicle. And this is what typically emerges from seeds first. Now, using the reserves stored inside the seed, the baby root grows into the soil, it's going to anchor the plant, and then it's going to start to absorb water. Once the water has been absorbed by the root, then the epicotyl, or that baby stem, is going to emerge from the seed. In plants that undergo epigeneous germination, this epicotyl is going to pull out the leaves, also known as those cotyledons. These are going to be drugged through the soil upward, and they're going to be done so where they're actually backwards, so that way that they're not damaged. And then the cotyledons are going to emerge from the soil. Now, the main job of the cotyledon is to transfer food from the reserves that's stored within the seeds, or actually in some plants, this food reserves are stored in the cotyledon. And it's going to do so that the plant will eventually start to create its first true leaves. And that way, this plant can become self-sufficient. And that way it can convert sunlight energy into chemical energy, enough for this plant to be able to survive. Now, some cotyledons do perform a little bit of photosynthesis, but it's really not enough to self-sustain the plant without the addition of those stored food reserves. Now, the trigger for the formation of those true leaves is typically when the plant develops a branch root system or a taproot. Then the plant is going to have those first true leaves, and now it's going to enter the vegetative stage. And the main job in the vegetative stage and for these leaf organs is to make food for the plant. For most annuals, they actually don't put a lot of energy in developing expansive root systems. The job of the root organ really is just to provide some anchoring structure and to take in those water and minerals, and it's used as a temporary energy storage during the vegetative stage. Now, once enough energy has been stored from this vegetative stage, annuals are going to go into the next stage, which is the reproductive stage. They're going to produce flowers, and these flowers will eventually form those new seeds. Now, once the new seeds for the next generation have been made, most annuals, all of the plant organs above ground and below ground, will completely die back. And the only way for this plant to come back on the landscape is going to be from the seeds left by the previous generation. For most annuals, they're on the landscape for a season or two. Now, there's always exceptions to the rules, and in warmer areas with milder winters, such as where I'm at in South Texas, some of these annuals can actually remain on the landscape for many seasons, but eventually, when we have major droughts or a big extended freeze, all of these plant organs would die, and again, the only way for this plant to return on the landscape is going to be from the seed produced by the previous generation. So as such, annuals can be prolific seed producers. Now, this is just an overview of the general patterns observed, but in nature, again, there can be exceptions to the rules and some minor detail differences, such as some plants actually don't produce cotyledons. Now, let's look at the life cycle of an annual forb that's found on the landscape this time of year. So, spiny sow thistle actually shows up in January to February in South Texas. So, during this time of year, after those seeds have emerged, this annual forms a rosette of leaves, and so this rosette of leaves are really close to the ground, and so they're going to be a little bit more tolerant of freezing temperatures as long as they're not too prolonged. Once enough energy has temporarily been stored in the roots, this plant will bolt, and it's going to produce stems with leaves, and they're going to continue to make food energy is going to be temporarily stored, and then it's going to make reproductive structures. So each reproductive structures on spiny sow thistles can produce on average up to 200 seeds, and this annual has several reproductive structures or composites of flowers, and they can actually average up to 23,000 seeds per plant. While annual sow thistles will not come back from the taproot, you really can't get rid of them just by mowing that bolting stem, because if the bolting stem is cut, it actually can reproduce another stem. After these seeds are produced, or if we have a drought or a prolonged freeze, then all these plant organs are going to die back, and the only way for this plant to come back on the landscape is by the seeds that were produced from the previous generation. Let's talk about some management strategies. The goal of an annual plant is to make seeds as quickly as possible. So our treatment goal is really going to be to reduce the seed bank, and so we need to destroy the plant before it produces more seeds. It's really important to treat annuals when they're in the vegetative state, that way before they produce more seeds. And these seeds can remain viable for several years, so you're going to need to repeat this treatment process for several years in a row until you deplete all the viable seeds that are actually in the seed bank. Now let's talk about biennial forbs. For biennials, they normally complete their life cycle in 2 growing seasons or maybe even 2 years. And during the first year, that seed is going to germinate, very similar to what happened with the annual plant. And the main goal is actually, after the seed germinates, is going to go into that vegetative state. And the main goal of that vegetative state, again, is going to be to convert that food energy, that sunlight energy, into chemical energy, and it's going to store it in the roots. These plants typically need to make it through a winter, so often the first vegetative state for a lot of our perennials is going to be in a rosette stage. Again, that ring of leaves, or that rosette stage, is really close to the ground. That way it can trap a little bit of air between the leaves and the soil and the ground level, and this helps them to be a little bit more resistant to freezing temperatures. After winter, when the growing season starts again, this plant will break dormancy. It will start the photosynthesis process again. It's going to store enough energy for the plant to actually bolt up. When it bolts up, the stem is going to be produced, and it's going to shoot up from the rosette, and it's going to make more leaves. And then it's going to be in its next vegetative stage, and it's going to make more food. After it produces enough energy, then this plant is going to go from a second vegetative stage into the reproductive stage, where it's going to make flowers. These flowers will actually produce seeds within them, and then just like an annual, this entire plant will die back. All the above ground and below ground organs will die back after it has gone through seed production. In some cases, biennials may go from seed germination to seed production this entire life cycle in one growing season, and this normally happens when we have extreme environmental conditions, such as a drought or extreme temperature variation. It can really cause the plant to react quickly to produce some seeds before the whole plant may die back completely because of the extreme weather event. In Texas, we do have 10 species of thistles, and some of them actually do follow this biennial life cycle. After the seed germinates, it starts off in that vegetative stage, that first one, as a rosette or ring of leaves. It's going to make food, and then it's going to overwinter. Then the next growing season is going to go into its second vegetative state. It's going to produce enough energy, it's going to bolt, it's going to produce a stem with leaves, and it's going to make additional food. Now, once plenty of food reserves have been made, it will go through the reproductive stage, where it will flower. The seeds will form inside the flowers. And a single thistle, it can produce up to about 4,000 seeds, so not as many typically as your annuals, but still quite a few seeds. And then after the next generation has been secured through the seed production, all these plant organs above ground and below ground will die back. With biennial forbs, their goal is to make seeds before the plant dies. So our treatment goal, very similar to an annual, is really to reduce the seed bank to destroy the plant before it produces more seeds. It's really important to treat these plants in the first vegetative stage before it produces more seeds or before it has a lot of food reserves. Again, these seeds can remain viable for several years, so you'll probably need to repeat treatment processes for several years in a row just to reduce the seed bank. Now let's talk about perennials. After a perennial has germinated from a seed, it does go into this vegetative state and it makes foods. Now, most perennials, they can either reproduce by seed, like annuals and biennials, or they can actually vegetatively reproduce. Vegetation reproduction is asexual reproduction, where a new plant forms from a part of that parent plant, such as like rhizomes or stolons or tubers, and it is a clone of the parent plant. Now, over winter, all of our perennial forbs and all of this soft herbaceous stems and leaves, they typically die back every year, but the plant is not dead. It is actually quite alive in the root system and secured underground. Now, the next growing season, when weather conditions become favorable, then the plant uses the energy that is stored in the roots to begin the vegetative stage again. And a perennial is going to continue to go through the vegetative, reproductive, and dormancy cycle for years and years and years to come until it can no longer make enough food to store in the roots of the plant to keep it alive, at which point it's going to leave this cycle and it will die back. With perennials, such as the silverleaf nightshade that we have on the landscape, they produce, fewer seeds than our annuals or biennials. So for this silverleaf nightshade, it's estimated they can produce a little bit over 2,200 seeds per plant. For perennial forbs, it actually invests more energy into vegetative reproduction instead of that seed production. Now, it does produced by seeds, but it does they do typically invest a little bit more energy into vegetative reproduction. So the treatment goal is going to be to get the plant uprooted or kill the plant at its roots where it's living. You actually may be able to spread a lot of perennials with disking or tillage because those little vegetative parts, they actually may be able to take root and form new plants. So you would want to treat with the herbicide at the ideal time, so that way that the herbicide moves from where you place it on the plant down to the roots for effective control. If you want to do mechanical treatment, then you need to individually uproot and discard the plant. Let's just sum all of this up. So while all of our little seeds that have germinated, they may not need direct sunlight to germinate. They do need the sunlight to warm the soil temperatures. These seedlings, once they emerge and they have those first true leaves, they do need sunlight to survive. So a couple of management strategies. If you want to get rid of forbs, if you have a good stand of grass, it's actually going to help decrease forb seedling survival. And if your management goal is to actually create more forbs in an area that's dominated by nothing but grasses, then you can actually do a little disking treatment to help promote sunlight energy, actually being able to reach those forbs once they pop up out of the soil and they have those first true leaves, and that will actually help promote forb seedling survival. Now again, for annuals and biennials, at some point in time, all these plant organs are going to die back, and so they're going to spend more energy into seed production and typically produce a lot more seeds compared to perennials. For perennials, these guys are persisting on the landscape year after year. If there's a severe drought, they may stay dormant and use the food reserves in the roots while they wait for ideal conditions before sending up new leaf growth to make more energy. Many perennial forbs can actually be spread by disking. Right here is all of my contact information, and I appreciate you guys listening to me go through like some of the different strategies of how forbs grow and their different life cycles, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your plant party.
All right, that was a great presentation. Next up, we're moving on to brush and trees. Dr. Camille Wiseman is a woodland ecologist with Texas A&M Forest Service based out of Austin. An ISA certified arborist, oak wilt certified, and tree risk assessment qualified. Today, she's going to speak on how brush or a tree grows. Welcome to Plant Party, Camille. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you all. Well, I want to clarify, I'm not a PhD or a doctor, but I'm honored to be in the room with many wonderful professionals. So I am going to start my timer so we stay on track. So my name is Camille Wiseman, a humble woodland ecologist out of Austin, and we're going to talk about how woody species grow. And hopefully in this amount of time, I can cover some very broad topics. We'll go over parts of the tree, compartmentalization of decay and how pruning impacts tree health and proper pruning. And then we'll discuss apical dominance and how that kind of leads to different growth abnormalities in trees. So we'll start with the roots. I always thought that the tree's canopy mirrored what the root system looked like below, but the reality is that a majority of the tree's root system occurs in the top 6 inches of soil. There may be some deep sinking roots that are there for stability, or in our hill country soils, we may have fissures in the geology that allow for roots to grow deeper. But in general, most of the tree's roots occur in that top inch of several inches of soil. And they can extend well beyond the drip line of the tree, so much so that when we're dealing with oak wilt, we assume that live oaks that are within 200 feet of one another have root systems that are shared. It's a amazing adaptation. Within the root system, we have lateral supporting roots and going all the way to microscopic single cell hairs on these on the ends of the roots. And so all meristematic tissue occurs on the roots and the shoots of the tree, the very tips. And so this is really important if we're dealing with root decline or root damage that doesn't that impacts how the tree can regrow when it's experienced dieback. So on the tree trunk, we have the areas of the tree that is actually the living tissue is really only on the outer edge of the tree's trunk. So the sapwood is the only living tissue in the tree. The internal heartwood is just the remaining cellulose and lignin that is remained from the cell walls of the sapwood. So the vascular cambium is where that meristematic tissue occurs. That's what we call secondary growth. So every year the tree is putting on a new growth ring, and that all occurs from a very small section of the sapwood called that vascular cambium. And it's building up xylem, which is the water conducting cells of the tree. And it's producing phloem, which is bringing nutrients from the canopy down into the roots of the tree. Here's kind of a close look under a microscope that shows the very, very small area where that meristematic tissue occurs. And the xylem, the water conducting vessels, are seen in that red dye. And then the phloem and the bark and the cork cambium, all of that occurs on the exterior side of the tree. So all of that is building up from that vascular system there. We get the questions all the time looking at a marvelous large tree. And they say, landowners will say, how old is this tree? And you can tell how old a tree is based off of observing the growth rings of the tree. And sometimes specific damage can be observed, such as the drought of the 1950s, that sometimes can be captured by observing the tree rings of it. By observing the tree rings. But this slide here is really to display that the growing conditions of that tree can dictate how fast it grows, how robust the canopy is, and how healthy it looks. So these two trees could very well be the same age, but because the tree on the left maybe has deeper soil, maybe sedimentation occurs here, organic matter is building up in this area, the tree has more resources, more water, and is able to have more consistent growth year after year from that secondary growth rings. And then a more sensitive location, a steep cliff, maybe there's thin soils, maybe it's at the top of an upland hill. That tree is going to have less growth and more compacted growth rings, and may not look the same, but could very well be the same age because it has grown on a more sensitive location. When it comes to the expansion of the canopy, the expansion of the root system, it's important to know in comparison to grasses where the meristematic tissue occurs at the base of the plant, right where the roots are, all of the new growth on trees occur in the buds. And so the tree is always growing and building upon its previous year's growth. And so the shoots of the tree occur annually, and that is where new growth occurs, except in the situation like I will reference Winter Storm Uri, where the tips of our trees experienced dieback, particularly those that are early bloomers, such as Arizona ash trees. And when we had Winter Storm Uri in 2021, all of the resources of the tree's spring growth occurred on the tips of that tree. Those trees were leafing out, and the severe weather, the severe winter conditions led to dieback in those tips. And so the secondary reserves is what was growing on mostly ash trees. And so that is what we call epicormic sprouts or adventitious growth. And so when we have primary dieback on those tips, the secondary growth is activated in what we might call water sprouts. And so this tree is still technically alive, but that aspect of the tree's primary growth and that initial canopy cover will never be reclaimed. That tree will always live with that dieback because those tips have died, and that is where the primary meristematic tissue occurs. So it's important to know how trees grow and understanding this process of compartmentalization of decay in trees. And so what we always say is trees do not heal, they seal. And so when there is a wound, a tree is able to activate these chemical and physical boundaries to prevent further decay, further spread, and it actually impacts how a tree grows over a wound. And so here's kind of an example where these 4 walls are activated in the tree to prevent the expansion of decay, pathogens. And so wall 1 is kind of where the xylem is occurring, the upward growth of that tree. The xylem gets activated to stop expansion. Wall number 2 stops inward growth from decay fungi. Wall 3 prevents the expansion laterally. And then wall 4 is kind of where the tree will grow over that wound and prevent further decay. Here is an example of what that might look like, where a wound occurred on the top of that photo there. Wall 1 is the xylem, so we're not really seeing wall 1 activated, but wall 2 prevents that decay from moving in towards the heartwood of the tree. Wall 3 prevents the decay from moving around the tree, and wall 4 allows the tree to grow over this exposure and further protect the tree. So wound closure, this is where we're looking at wall 4 and why proper pruning is really critical. Here's a photo of where that fully occurs over that branch, and we're able to prevent further pathogens from entering the tree. So over a period of several years, the tree may be able to expand that growth and protect itself over time. And that is because of a chemical aspect of the tree that occurs in the branch collar. So we have this branch bark ridge, which occurs at the union of the branch and the tree. There's this kind of pulse or this bump that occurs at the bottom of that union. And when we make a proper pruning cut, that section of the tree is able to be activated to grow over that wound. And so it's very important that when we're making pruning cuts on trees, we keep that branch collar intact. So when we're making our pruning cut, we want to make our first undercut to prevent any stripping to occur. The second cut occurs above that, and then the final cut occurs just outside of the branch bark ridge. Further emphasis on how trees grow, there's a concept or there's a phenomenon called apical dominance, in which the shoots of the tree that are the tallest will receive the most resources. And so when we are planning for trees near our home and we want to have a tree with good structure, we want to emphasize a strong central leader. So in this example here, if we have stem A, B, and C left intact, all 3 of those will become competing leaders, and that can lead to poor structure over time. And so when we're looking at our trees, we're thinking about making pruning cuts. We want to have good structure, so we want to have reduction cuts to emphasize one single central leader. So when we're making reduction cuts, we want to subordinate the expansive growth of one tree, but we want to bring our cut back to the next largest lateral shoot or branch. And this will allow the tree to send resources, aesthetically keep that structure of your branch intact, and not lead to kind of some abnormal growth, which can occur. This is a tree from my house on branches that I did not cut. But this shows how an improper heading cut can lead to that advantageous growth, similar to the damage that we saw after Winter Storm Uri. So when you make a heading cut, the tree is going to send many resources to resprout. Because these cuts did not occur to the next lateral branch, we have some epicormic sprouting or water sprouts. Here is the some examples of epicormic sprouting that occurred after Winter Storm Uri, particularly with those ash trees. So in this case, we had primary dieback of the branches on the very ends of the tree. all of that tissue is no longer living. And so what the tree does is go back to its next living branch. This is where a lot of carbohydrates are stored in these primary branches of the tree, and we get this rapid resprouting effect. And so here's kind of a closer look, and this is technically these trees are still alive, but its structure is permanently damaged. And so, this tree may not be a good tree to keep in your yard because there are weak unions on these branches. And as those trees grow year after year, we can have weak branch attachments that can lead to failure. We'll talk about briefly crepe murder, which is unfortunately kind of a common practice for trees, for crepe myrtles. And this is similar to those heading cuts and those topping. And if we're thinking about the meristematic tissue and the constant growth that this tree needs to put out to support its whole system, this is a way that you can slowly kill your trees. And so topping of crepe myrtles is not the most effective way to get a good healthy tree. This leads to the weakening of the tree year after year, and furthermore, those weak unions. So these are some pretty extreme examples of crepe murder. And then we'll talk briefly about the growth abnormalities that we see with oak sprouts. And so that epicormic sprouting is mostly related to stress response in trees. So when it's had major dieback, if the tree is losing carbohydrates and losing its kind of carbon requirements to support the whole system, we'll see epicormic sprouting, and sometimes we'll see these advantageous sprouts that occur. And so sometimes this is the response to new sunlight availability. So this may occur if you're doing brushwork around an existing tree and there's all of a sudden newly available light. The tree can say, hey, I can maximize this sunlight. I can put out my solar panels to grow carbohydrates, and you'll get sometimes get this sprouting. But more often than not, this is part of the cycle of resprouting species such as oaks. And so over time, we may have dieback of that primary branch, and the tree is basically telling its system it's resprouting from the roots to adapt to the next generation of mature canopy. And so over the course of 50, 100 years, these sprouts, through that process of the epicormic dominance, is where we'll have one sprout, several sprouts kind of take the lead, and all of those resources will go into that single stem development. And over time, we may get to the point where we have a full oak mott, where maybe in this photo below, we had one single stem as the primary tree. That tree died back and the root system was still intact, and that secondary growth was able to send out new sprouts. And then we are kind of left with this kind of oak grove. So that's kind of a common question that we get. So in conclusion, I want to just emphasize the importance of keeping the branch collar intact when you're making pruning cuts on your tree, because that helps the tree protect itself over time. And here's my contact info. So with 15 seconds to spare. So thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to looking at any questions in the comments.
Great. That was fantastic, Camille. Thank you so much for that presentation. We're ready to get our last presentation started. Our final speaker is our own Plant Party host, Tim Sigmund. Tim is the Private Lands Program Leader for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. He was born and raised in Giddings, Texas, and completed a bachelor's degree in graduate research at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, followed by employment with Texas Parks and Wildlife in 2009. In College Station, Tim was responsible for 7 counties performing wildlife surveys, public outreach, technical guidance, prescribed fire assistance, public hunting opportunities, wildlife tax valuation planning, and dealing with other wildlife issues. Starting in 2017, Tim began his role in the Private Lands Program Leader position, dealing with private landowner issues in a statewide capacity. Tim resides in College Station with his wife and 3 adorable children. I'll turn it over to you, Tim, to speak on spring ephemerals, early bloomers for Texans to know.
Well, thank you all for coming, and sorry to stand between you and the end. But so to wrap this thing up with spring green up, we were going to talk about some of the first flowers that you might see this spring. You know, if you're down here in College Station, with that cold weather we had the last few weeks of February, things are a couple weeks behind. So some of our trees are still just budding out here in the last 2 weeks. The red buds started blooming late, those sorts of things. We're going to talk about some of those early bloomers and some of those that are really what we call ephemeral plants. And so when we talk about what an ephemeral plant is, what does that mean? It means lasting for a short time. So that could result in something that is just related to the bloom period. That could result in the plant being apparent at all. Sometimes they bloom and flower and die back to underneath the ground level if they're perennials immediately after a short period in the spring. This could mean related to soil temperatures as to when they actually choose to do their blooming. It could be certain moisture regimes. So if you think about the Trans-Pecos or high plains, there might be species that are ephemeral and only bloom after a rain event during the monsoon seasons, especially in Trans-Pecos mountainous areas and things like that. It could mean all of these things at once. They need the right soil temperature, the right time of year, and the right moisture to choose to bloom. Something that you might think of as an ephemeral species that a lot of us see pretty often are either white rain lilies or copper rain lilies that occur after a good soaking rain in the late spring or early summer. So why would something choose to have this flowering strategy or this strategy of occurring during these time periods? It's usually going to be a drought avoidance strategy. So if they're blooming early in the spring or late winter, most of the state, not always, but most of the time, is going to have some of its best soil moisture at that time. And that's related to our lower evapotranspiration rates during that time. We usually have lower temperatures. The moisture that does fall stays in the soil for longer. It's a competitive advantage for light, space, or seed development. So maybe a fire burned through the previous fall after a droughty summer, and now there's not much vegetation for these things to compete with, or nothing else is taking nutrients or water out of the soil because it's not actively growing at the time. So it's available for these plants to do their best. And that maximizes the success of those individual plants and overall that species population so they can grow, flower, produce seed, and carry on to the next generation, much as we learned about through the other talks we heard about today. And occasionally, if it goes on long enough, these species, if they bloom at those early time frames, there can be special relationships with pollinators that emerge at the same time that those species do. And so if we're talking about urban or suburban things you might have in your own yard, this is my neighbor's house. It's not really an ephemeral species, but something this tree species chooses to do. It's an early bloomer. It's the eastern redbud. If you're in the Texas Hill Country or the Edwards Plateau region, you might have the Texas redbud out there, which is very similar, slightly smaller leaves, slightly different flower, but for most part the same, functionally the same. But usually I associate this with blooming around Valentine's Day. This year it's in full bloom right now, almost a month later than we typically have those blooms beginning because of the cold temperatures we had before. So that's related to some of that soil temperature and day length stuff we were talking about earlier. And so, like I was saying, you have those bloom periods at then, but this is a very important, from a tree standpoint, species that blooms when not many other flowers are out there. So you'll see red buds, wild plums, and then follow that with dogwoods and other things starting to bloom in these time frames when not much else is out there. So these are heavily visited by early season pollinators. So another one that a lot of you might have in your own front yard or in fallow farm fields or even farm fields that are hit pretty often is a non-native species that pops up in early spring, but by the time we start hitting 90 degrees regularly, it's gone. You don't see it anymore, either its leaves or its flowers for most of the rest of the year. And that's henbit. So this is one of those that pops up in every yard, or at least those that aren't putting out a broadleaf herbicide application pretty much everywhere. That can be fairly heavily used by some of our butterfly species and that sort of stuff that you see out there. Another one that's a native species that many of you may be seeing right now, particularly if you've gotten any rainfall in the last 2 weeks, are some of the anemones that occur in Texas. So there's two different species. These are usually fairly low growing. These flowers are usually less than a foot to a foot and a half tall, typically less than a foot. That top photo is Anemone tuberosa, which you'll find in the western Edwards Plateau, high plains, all the way out into the Trans-Pecos, called desert anemone. The bottom photo is actually from my front yard. I took this just 2 days ago, and that's Carolina anemone. And that one has a fairly wide distribution throughout the state. There's also 10-petal anemone, which occurs basically between these two and all the way to the Louisiana border. Again, slightly different petal structure, slightly different flower structures to it. But these are found in yards, open grasslands, savannas, and prairies. They can start blooming as early as February. When I see this, I know things are really warming up and we're about to get leaves from our trees bursting open, and we're about to have oaks going into flower and that sort of thing. But fairly widespread species, but one of those really early bloomers with a fairly showy flower that's pretty obvious. Ones we don't often think about are these low-growing woodland species, so violets. Viola soriora, or the common blue violet, is pretty much widespread throughout the Central Plains and Eastern United States. It's the one with the widest distribution in Texas. And this is usually a pretty good sign that spring has sprung. So these are in full flower when all those trees are starting to burst into bud. They're a great early larval host for a lot of our early emerging butterfly species. A lot of fritillaries use this. Early nectar source for as well for those adult butterflies. So they're not only using the flowers, but they're also laying their eggs on the leaves. And there's at least 4 other important species in the eastern portions of Texas that occur pretty often as well. Missouri violet is another one I see fairly often on the landscape. Again, often less than 6 inches in height, often less than 4 inches in height, but can be fairly widespread across woodland floors, stream bottoms, sunny savannas that have good soil moisture or clay pans in them. You'll see these pretty often. Another one that you'll find in suburban areas pretty often, this again, the top photo on the top right, this is a tiny bluet. So these bluets only have 4 petals. You can see it's got a fairly widespread distribution in Texas, into South Texas, in the Central Hill Country, and up into the cross timbers of North Texas. This was growing in my front yard here just the other day. There's a number of bluet species that are out there. This is one of those that emerges in February or March. And again, as soon as we start hitting the mid-80s with regularity, this whole plant will die back down to ground level, and you probably won't even notice it's there. There may be 1 or 2 leaves sticking above the ground. Otherwise, it's done doing anything for the rest of the year until we get back to the early spring again. Lastly, one of our most common spring ephemerals, I've seen this blooming as early as mid-January around my house. I have some in my backyard. This photo is actually from my backyard in 2021 when this species was blooming. This was the week before the Winter Storm Uri that we were talking about earlier. It was already blooming then. Of course, it got killed. But this species is Spring Beauty. So this is Virginia Spring Beauty, this picture, and it's Claytonia virginica. It's fairly widespread in the state, and it's no more than 6 inches in height as well. So a lot of these things are really low in height. So that tells you something about their competitive edge. In Stacy's presentation earlier, she was talking about if you want to reduce these forbs or these things, you have a really healthy stand of grass. It crowds them out. So in areas that are mowed frequently, grazed heavily, occasionally burned, or have a lot of leaf litter, these are the species that can pop up and take advantage of nothing else growing, the low vegetation heights of other plant species, and persist well. And so this Virginia Spring Beauty that I was talking about, it has a particular species of bee that is adapted to subsist only on it. So this minor bee species occurs across the eastern U.S. It's a specialist only on Spring Beauty, so it emerges, creates an egg chamber. They're solitary bees. It's a minor bee, so they're ground nesters. And they're out only when this is blooming. They harvest the pollen, take it back to the egg chambers, deposit it, and that's what their young feed on. And they only produce 1 generation per year. So they're strictly tied to this species. Luckily for them, it's fairly widely distributed and common. But without it, this species would not exist. And I would guess that that particular flower probably would also not be as widespread without this bee's presence. So sometimes when you look for these things, I never thought I'd use Little John and the East Side Boys in a presentation. but you got to get low. For anybody in college in the early 2000s, this was a common theme that you heard fairly often if you went out to dance at all. But those low growing plants are taking advantage, like I mentioned, of that geology, that period after fire or before everything else grows. So those low vegetation heights may mean if they're not in full bloom and real obvious and you want to see them out there, you have to get down and look for them. In particular, something that is a part of that Jason Singhurst has done a lot of research on is Texas meadow rue. So this is a group of species that is typically less than 13 inches in height. It grows in this early spring time frame. It's probably in bloom right now over in Lick Creek Park here in College Station, which is one of the places where it's known from. And as of 2007, this plant is only known from 10 populations covering 33 acres. So it's usually about 6 to 8 inches height. It can be over a foot in wetter years. That March to early April timeframe, it really depends on moisture and the soil temperature. This year, it's probably blooming now. Other years, when we are warmer, it may have been blooming as early as the first week of March or even late February. There are 5 other species of meadow rue in the state. We're kind of on the edge of this distribution, but these are those lower growing, less obvious wildflower species that are out there hiding in some of these damp or moist woodlands that aren't frequently flooded, but have a good moisture regime that allow these things to grow. This is a perennial plant. This particular species is only found in Texas and only from those 10 populations. So the genus in general, this is that Thalcitrum genus. This is its distribution across the nation. And so you notice Texas is kind of on the southern edge of its distribution. You've got 4 of the species only found on the eastern portions of the state, and most of those only found in a few counties and a few locations. And then you have a much more widespread one out in West Texas and some of our mountainous systems. I think it's called Fernal's meadow rue. That's much more widespread. And that one can actually get up to 3 feet in height. So very different growth habits for different members of that genus. And so this next little bit, since Jason Singhurst wasn't able to make it because of a medical emergency, I relied heavily on one of my good friends who has an excellent blog that goes into some of his photography. This one is a collection of spring ephemerals from him. So if you're ever in East Texas and some of the national forests or private lands out there, you may have seen some of these before. Hillsides covered in May apples, which are a spring plant that pops up and dies back before the heat of summer. Matt Buckingham has this, and most of these photos are from his blog post about Trillium in his Naturalist Journey blog that can be found at mattbuckinghamphotography.com. And so he talks about this species, bloodroot. Again, another 4 to 6 inch tall species. It's named for its root sap being blood red. There's only a few populations known in Texas. Another one that pops up, bloom is done by early April, usually less than 4 inches height, sometimes as tall as 8 inches. So this is another one that has a fairly limited distribution in Texas, but kind of follows that tallgrass prairie ecoregion, kind of right there where the tallgrass prairie is mixing with oak savannas back and forth. This one's going to grow in the leaf litter in post oak savannas. And this one is white trout lily. So there's actually some events in the DFW area where folks will go out and look for these, because this occurs all the way out into that Cross Timbers ecoregion and into the northern Edwards Plateau out there. It's uncommon throughout its range, but where it's found, you can see acres of these things when the soil moisture conditions and temperatures really cooperate. Again, you can see right there, that's leaf litter on the bottom. This is only sticking up 4 to 6 inches. Yellow trout lily, another species that's more common in the Ouachitas and Ozarks to the northeast of Texas, but is found from a few populations. But where it's found in Texas in rich beach forests with these steep ravines, what they call mesic forest slopes in East Texas, it can cover acres of the forest floor. And this typically has a March bloom time, and that's going to be that yellow colored flower there. But again, usually less than 6 inches height. So you really have to get down. And you can see here it is mixed in on some of that rich woods with a bunch of southern red oak leaves there in the forest floor mixed with loblolly pine needles and a fairly rich distribution of that yellow trout lily underneath there. So trilliums. This is another group of species with a fairly wide distribution overall on the West Coast and throughout the eastern U.S., but a very limited distribution in Texas. And you can see it kind of hugs from most of Texas It hugs kind of the Sabine and Neches River basins, a few over into the Trinity River Basin, but mostly it's from the Neches River east. So just that eastern eighth of the state. I don't know what Travis County has going on over there, that there's one randomly over there. But Sabine River wake robin or Sabine River trillium is a photo here, and you can see it's pretty much following the flowage path of the Sabine River. It's on those pine slopes above creek and river floodplains, and it can make beautiful displays like this of very small flowers with those mottled leaves and pretty good colonies along those. Again, an early spring, you're not going to see these much into May at all. They're going to be done by around Easter when they're up and blooming, but many more trillium species to the east of this portion of the state. The other thing to think about when you're doing this is there's lots of others that are tied to that geology and hydrology we talked about. So they may not be as ephemeral in their bloom times, but they are tied to certain geologies that could be things that have stone outcrops or certain soils in certain locations. But hydrology is a big one. So most of these species are going to occur on those mid slopes where moisture is a little more dependable. Or just above where it typically floods. So they don't like standing water. They don't like dry sites. They want that something in between, and that's where they do their best. And like I said, like Little John, you got to get down there and get low. And if you're searching out on your property or on public lands, look for those things that are just a little bit different. Maybe not at the top of an iron ore ridge, but just along that edge where the soil gets a little deeper, where you have a spring or a seep, and along those edges where it can dry out occasionally. And you may even get some species like this rose begonia orchid or the Jack in the Pulpit orchid on the right-hand side that are known from just a few populations. And so a lot of those species that you see, if you don't see them in the next few weeks, you will not see them bloom again until the following year. It's not like Indian blankets or other species where they bloom anytime we get rain, or as long as we have dependable moisture, they're going to bloom from May through October, something like that. These are a few weeks in the springtime. As we warm up, as we have good overwinter moisture, you'll have better years or worse years. But you can go to the same location and you may be able to find the leaves, but the plant will have already bloomed, dependent upon those soil temperatures, like we had talked about earlier in the day, and on those moisture regimes and when good moisture came through paired with those right soil temperatures. So those are some of those things you can see out there. I encourage you to get outside, look for some of these plants. You may talk to folks if you live in the DFW area about the trout lilies that may be coming out right now, and look for those and enjoy some of the early flowers of spring. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Tim. I'm impressed with incorporating Little John into the plant party. Also want to give thanks to our door prize sponsors, Bamert Seed, InView Range and Pasture, Native American Seed, Quail Forever, Renewable Resources Extension Act, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We appreciate your support for Plant Party. Thanks again to all our speakers and to all of you for attending our 18th Plant Party webinar. Again, Plant Party is a quarterly advanced plant webinar training series brought to you by USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Our next plant party will be on June 18th with the theme, Getting to the Root of Soil. You won't want to miss out on that dirty fun. We'll see you next time.